So thank you very much for coming here. I hope I can offer you something that may be of value. I suppose the first thing I want to do is I want to ask a couple of questions of myself and then try and answer them. And the first is, well, why would we be commemorating a writer anyway? I mean, surely we all know about commemorations of, the outbreak of the First World War. And in our own case, of course, we have the commemorations. Well, this year we had Gallipoli as well, which is a big thing. The President was in Gallipoli alongside Prince Charles and Prince Harry, marking the fact that so many Irishmen fought in that terrible campaign. And then, of course, next year we'll have the centenary of the Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme, both huge events in Irish history and in British history indeed. And so, everyone is familiar with that idea of commemorating major events. And, last weekend there was a 75th anniversary event or series of events for the Battle of Britain, and so on. And, of course, at the moment especially, there seems to be no end of commemorative centenaries and bicentenaries. I mean, in the last few months I've been at the bicentenary of the Battle of Waterloo, the bicentenary of the birth of Anthony Trollope, the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, the 100th anniversary of Gallipoli, and so forth. So, a lot of political anniversaries like that. But then I suppose you ask yourself, well, why would you be commemorating a writer? And my answer really is that great writers tell us something about ourselves as people, because they're people who, in years gone by, in centuries gone by, have kind of mulled over and reflected on human life and all it involves and the world around us, and they've left us a kind of a record which is memorable in itself and which stands the test of time. So, next year, for example, is the 400th anniversary of the death of Shakespeare. And I suppose our world would be a poorer place if Shakespeare somehow had failed to ever put pen to paper and leave behind all those great plays. And likewise, I would say that in the case of W.B. Yeats, he's left us a very rich legacy of words and ideas, which, again, I'd say definitely stand the test of time. And that's the best test of all, because it's easy to be popular today and for a week or a year or a couple of years, but things that can retain their popularity over decades, generations, centuries, millennia are obviously things that you have to take seriously. So I certainly am of the view that we should be proud of our writers, and we should be proud to celebrate our writers. Not just Yeats, but also James Joyce, John Millington Synge, John O'Casey, George Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde, Seamus Heaney, and so on. William Trevor in more recent times, John Banville. The Irish have made a substantial contribution really to the world of literature, and we should take some satisfaction in that. I mean, we shouldn't overdo it, but certainly I found that our writers are a great calling card for Ireland. We don't have we're not a huge country, so we don't kind of have a major companies, for example, that brand Ireland in a way that, say, I don't know, BMW or Siemens might brand Germany, or Ericsson might brand Sweden, or Nokia might brand Finland. And I've always found that our literary tradition is a good way of actually introducing Ireland. And I remember when I was in Germany, every year we had an open day when we invited Germans to come in and visit the embassy. We taught them a bit of Irish, we had a bit of Irish music, we put on a few things for them, gave them a sample of Irish food. But the thing that I remember most clearly is that we'd all gather around this old poster we had up at the embassy with all the Irish writers. And they would go, oh, I didn't know he was Irish. I didn't know he was Irish. So it was kind of a way of surprising Germans, who at that time probably thought of us only as a country whose banks didn't work particularly well. It was nice to be able to kind of show them that there was a bit more to Ireland. And I remember at that time traveling around Germany I did about 15 lectures over a period of a year or so on W.B. Yeats. We had a little bit of an exhibition, and I travelled around Germany with it to Freiburg and Munster and Hamburg and so forth, and Marburg, and all these German universities. And at a time when Ireland was kind of under a cloud in Germany because of the banking crisis, it was great to be able to attract an audience of a couple of hundred people coming to listen to a lecture about an Irish poet. And of course, I always managed to slip in a few little stories about Ireland and our economy as well, just while they weren't noticing. When I had them, diverted on to Yeats, I would slip in a little thing to say that our economy wasn't too bad either, by the way, and we were recovering. And I like to think that helped to kind of avoid Ireland being demonised in Germany as a kind of a country that was unable to manage itself financially. Anyway, so that's one of the reasons. But I think there's a second reason in the case of W.B. Yeats, and that is that he in particular has interrogated and interpreted Ireland more than any other writer, because for his whole life, essentially, he was concerned with Ireland. The amazing thing about Yeats is that he lived probably more than half of his life here in England, but he wrote practically hardly a single poem based here in this country. Now that wasn't because he didn't have an interest in this country, but he saw himself as an Irish poet. And therefore, from the 1880s until the 1930s, he was constantly writing about Ireland. And that means he's left us a kind of a record of that period in Irish history, which I think is very valuable. So there are three reasons why I like to celebrate Yeats. And I have it boiled down to three words: words, witness, and wisdom. We start with the words. Yeats was a great craftsman, a great user of words. He once said that his goal was to be musical and to have the right words in the right order. That was his aim. And I'd like to demonstrate by reciting one of his poems just how good he was at writing these musical poems which stay in the memory, and I can even recite it even at my age. When you are old and grey and full of sleep and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep. Then he loved your moments of glad grace, or loved your beauty with love false or true. But one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face. And bending down beside the glowing bars, whisper a little sadly how love fled and paced upon the mountains overhead and hid his face amid a crowd of stars. Now let me tell you, that poem is, I think, first of all, I don't believe there's a single word in that poem that you wouldn't hear used every day by people who are not academics or poets. So there's hardly a single difficult or obscure, well, there isn't a single difficult or obscure or unusual word when you are old and grey and full of sleep. All words that, are used every day, I dare say most of us have probably used all of those words in the course of today's day. So, but the power of Yeats's work is that he puts the words together properly and combines them. Glad grace, a pilgrim soul. That's my favourite line of Yeats, I think, whenever I'm asked, when one man loved the pilgrim soul in you. Because my view is that we should all have pilgrim souls. We should all be on some kind of pilgrimage rather than sitting back and you know, smelling the roses and putting their feet up and being sort of complacent. We should all be trying to discover on life's pilgrimage something that we didn't know before. So that's the first illustration I wanted to give you. Of Yeats as a master of combining words in a musical form. You were old and grey, full of sleep, and all by the fire. You could almost sing it. You don't need music, actually. There's music in the words themselves. And that's the great beauty of Yeats. And really, throughout his life, he was able to continue this ability to use words clearly and powerfully and with a great sense of the power of words. So even though his later poems are much more complicated, and the early poems are dealing with much more difficult subjects, be it the politics of the unruly world following the First World War, turning and turning in a widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Near anarchy is loosed upon the world. Everywhere the blood-dimmed tide is loosed. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Now, that poem was written in 1919, and it's obviously a meditation about the nature of the world at that time, this turbulent, violent world that he saw during the First World War, and then the Easter Rising and the beginnings of the Irish struggle for independence, and the Bolshevik Revolution, of course. All these things were happening. But Yeats managed to put them into simple words. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. I wrote to a present-day politician there a few months ago, inviting him to come and read a poem at our Balloons Day, Yeats Day event on the 16th of June. And I got a formal letter back from his office, but scribbled in the margins was, things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. So even today, those words are useful for a politician to bear in mind. But actually, in fairness, the centre has held to a large extent. But today, of course, we also find we're in a world where the centre seems to be under threat from various people with extreme views of one kind or another. So, in that sense, Yeats is a man not just of his time, but of our time as well. So my second illustration of the power of Yeats's poetry is a poem he wrote in the early 20th century, when he was getting a bit frustrated and disenchanted because of his inability to secure the affections of Maud Gonne, his great, the love of his life, and he never managed to. He proposed to her several times, but each time it was a Nivek or Niha or a Russian Yet, or a German Nein. Anyway, Nein Danke, she said. Although she did give a very amusing, it's kind of a very elaborate excuse for turning him down. She said, well, if I marry you, you'll be too happy. And then you need to be unhappy in order to write the great poems that you write. And the people of the world will give out to me and complain to me because I deprived them of your great work. I thought, that's the best projections thing I've ever come across. Fair play to her, she's obviously a woman of intelligence and insight. But, you know, he was frustrated by her kind of devotion to politics at the expense of her personal life and personal happiness. He wrote this poem, No Second Troy. Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery? Or that she would of late have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or hurled the little streets upon the great, had they but courage equal to desire? What could have made her peaceful, with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire, with beauty like a tightened bow, a kind that is not natural in an age like this, being high and solitary and most stern. Why? What could she have done being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn? Again, it's a much more complex poem than the one that when you wrote Grateful Sleep, because it's grappling with this this enigmatic woman who seemed to want to teach to ignorant men most violent ways. She wanted to be a revolutionary rather than a dreamer and an artist. But what it shows you is that even as he became more disenchanted and angry, if you like, the ability to combine words didn't desert him. So, for example, with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire. Her mind was like a fire, it's simple, straightforward. And things like, with beauty, like a tightened bow. I think we can see Maud Gonne in that image. So, as he became more complicated, as he became more irritated and irritable with things around him, he never lost that ability to craft words and to put words together to the best possible effect. And the third poem I want to read from, illustrate this great ability Yeats had with words, great wordsmith, is The Wild Swans at Coole. This is based on a visit he made to Coole Park, which was the home of Lady Augusta Gregory. Yeats was a regular visitor to Augusta Gregory's home in County Galway, near Gort, because he could live in a very leisurely environment. Lady Gregory was a great admirer of his, she was a collaborator of his in setting up the Abbey Theatre. She was a woman of similar mindset to his own. She was an aristocrat, but she was also an Irish nationalist. So Yeats wrote this poem about seeing these swans and realizing that he had first seen them 19 years before, and reflecting on the passage of time and wondering, who will the swans be entertaining when he's gone? So it's a much more sophisticated, elaborate and complex poem. But again, the key to it is, what I'm trying to illustrate here, is the great way in which it's written, the simple language that's used. The trees are in their autumn beauty. The woodland paths are dry. Under the October twilight, the water mirrors a still sky. Upon the brimming water among the stones are 59 swans. I have looked upon those brilliant creatures, and now my heart is sore. All's changed since I, peering at twilight, the first time on this shore, the bell beat of their wings above my head trod with a lighter tread. Now they drift on the still water, mysterious, beautiful. Among what rushes will they build? By what lake's edge or pool delight men's eyes when I awake someday to find they have flown away? So there you have this very interesting poem reflecting on the passage of time and wondering about what had happened to these swans in the future and how he will miss them when they're gone, and how he will at some stage no longer be able to see these beautiful creatures flying away. Again, the trees are in their autumn beauty. It's a perfect line, really. The trees are in their autumn beauty. You can't imagine any way of improving on that line. Every word there serves a purpose. So that's why I say that Yeats, from the beginning of his writing life to the very end, was always able to come up with these wonderful phrases that stick in the mind and that show that he was a supreme craftsman, supreme moulder of the English language. Now, my second point is witness. And I don't mean witness for the prosecution or I don't mean it in a religious sense. I mean that he was a witness to his times. You see, you might assume W.B. Yeats, well, you see this portrait of him here, which is very good, by the way, well done, whoever the artist is. But you might say, well, he's a dreamy, romantic poet who lived in an ivory tower, and sure, he wouldn't have had much to do with the everyday life of the world, but in fact he had, because not only as the German said, not only was he, as a young man, he constantly spoke to the people who worked for his family and lived in the area where where his grandparents lived in Sligo. His grandparents were a merchant family in Sligo, Poixtons, and Yeats was constantly interrogating the local people, the people who worked for the family, about the stories and the folklore of Ireland. Fascinated by the folklore of Ireland. He believed that somehow in the folk memory of the Irish people, of the Irish peasantry, as they would have been known in those days, there was a wisdom, there was a folk wisdom, which the modern world had lost because of materialism and all of that. And somehow, if you could kind of go back into that world of the old stories and the old mythology, Ireland could teach the world something something that it had lost because of the evolution of Victorian prosperity and the imperial and materialistic world of the late 19th century. So he was rebelling against his father's generation's kind of conception of the world. And he believed that the Irish history, Irish mythology, and the Irish people, the people of the west of Ireland, the rural people, had a wisdom embedded in their lives and in their spirits that if it only could be brought out to teach the world to see things in a different way. And actually, even towards the end of his life, when he wrote his final poem, Under Ben Bulben, it's a valedictory poem. It's a poem which contains his famous words that are on his tombstone in Sligo: "Cast the cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by." But in that poem, he has a line, "And ancient Ireland knew it all." In other words, at the end of his life, he believed that somehow in ancient Ireland, for all he was disenchanted by the modern Ireland he saw in the 20s and 30s, he believed that embedded in the experience of ancient Ireland, there was something special. So he became this, first of all, far from being a dreamy romantic poet, he, from an early age, he met the old Fenian John O'Leary in Dublin in the late 1880s. And O'Leary gave him books about Ireland and Irish history and Irish literature. And Yeats read those, and that converted him and turned him into an Irish poet. Otherwise, he probably would have ended up going the same way as Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw, moved to England, gained an audience in England. Okay, a bit of colourful Irishness in you, but nothing. But the connection with Ireland would have been very limited. But in fact, Yeats spent most of his life engaged in Irish public life. And for example, the 1890s, he spent an inordinate amount of time arguing in favour of a national literature for Ireland. Now, at that time, many people would have said, especially, for example, Mahaffy, who was at that stage the provost of Trinity College, was a very staunch unionist. Mahaffy said that there was nothing in Irish literature that wasn't either obscene or vulgar. But Yeats thought otherwise. And he said at one stage that Ireland, now listen to this, Ireland, he said, is one of the 7 great fountains in the garden of the world's imagination. So far from regarding Ireland as this kind of provincial backwater looked down on by Victorian sophisticates, Yeats believed that it was one of the 7 fountains in the garden of the world's imagination, along with the Indian mythological poems, the Japanese tradition, the Chinese, the poems of the Charlemagne cycle, and so on. So he really did make huge claims for Ireland. At one stage he wrote that there is no literature without nationality and no nationality without literature. So in other words, he was trying to combine the idea of an Irish literature with the idea of an Irish nationality, which would develop. And he believed that you could have a first-class literature, which would also be a national literature. And for example, in a poem called To Ireland in the Coming Times, he wrote that he wanted to be numbered among those who sang to sweeten Ireland's wrong. In other words, he wanted to be like Davis and Mangan and the Young Ireland poets, but he wanted to do it at a standard of literary excellence that they never aspired to, because they were political poets, whereas he was a poet first, who was also willing to write poems which would have a national purpose. So, in 1904, he founded the Abbey Theatre, along with Lady Gregory. It's still our national theatre. 1903, he wrote the famous patriotic play, Kathleen Ni Houlihan. And in fact, afterwards, he wrote in one of his later poems, did a play of mine send out certain men the English shot? Because I think it was Stephen Gwynn, who at that time was a member of the Westminster Parliament and also a writer and intellectual. When he saw that play, he said, you shouldn't go to that play unless you're willing to take up arms afterwards, because it was such a powerful play. And of course, for Yeats, it had a special appeal, because the figure of Kathleen Ni Houlihan, the old woman, personifies Ireland, was played by Maud Gonne. So it had a personal and a political significance. So at that stage, you could say Yeats was as far as Irish nationalists were concerned, he would have been seen as an advanced nationalist. Someone who, indeed, it seems likely, at some stage in the 1890s, he became a member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Now, I doubt if he ever did anything other than maybe attend one or two meetings, but I suppose he liked the idea of secret societies, and being a member of one probably appealed to his particular personality. But anyway, from about 1905 onwards, he started to become quite disenchanted with Ireland. One reason was that Maud Gonne went off and married John McBride, Major John McBride, a marriage that everyone knew would be a disaster, and it was. And they broke up after a couple of years, and then she came running back to Yeats, and he sort of supported her, but then still wasn't able to persuade her to accept his proposals of marriage. Anyway, by 1913, Yeats had become thoroughly disillusioned with Ireland, and he had this really quite sharp poem, September 1913, with romantic Ireland's dead and gone. It's with O'Leary in the grave, and it's very critical of what he sees as the narrowness of nationalist Ireland. He was disenchanted for two reasons. One was because of the negative reaction to Synge's Playboy in the Western World, where there were disturbances in the Abbey Theatre by those who thought the Playboy was a slight to Irish womanhood, and therefore wasn't acceptable as a play to be performed in our national theatre. And secondly, he wanted to build a gallery to house the paintings donated to the Irish people by Hugh Lane, who was a collector of art and Lady Gregory's nephew. He died on the Lusitania in 1913, and the ownership of those paintings is still disputed to this day, and they're now shared between the National Gallery in Dublin and the National Gallery in London. But there's still an ongoing, I suppose, unresolved dispute about those. Those are our elegant marbles, by the way. Actually, Roy Foster, the art historian in Oxford, has been stirring the pot on this one recently in article in The Guardian and in a lecture he gave at the National Gallery. And in fact, the National Gallery director said he thought that Foster was probably right. These paintings really did belong to Ireland. So we'll see what happens. I'll do my best. Anyway, in 1913 he declares that romantic Ireland's dead and gone. It's with O'Leary in the grave, with John O'Leary in the grave. But lo and behold, 3 years later, romantic Ireland is resurrected and jumps up again because Easter 1916. Yeats was sort of, he was quite astonished by this because he had not expected it. I would say in 1916, Yeats was about to kind of go the way of Wilde and Shaw and, chuck in his interest in Ireland and basically, devote himself to becoming a pillar of the literary establishment in London rather than bothering about the seeming needs of my fool-driven land, as he once put it. But then Easter Rising came along and he was astonished by this. He was staying down in Gloucester with an artist called Sir William Rothenstein when he heard the news. And he said he had no idea that any public event could move him so much. And it moved him to write probably the greatest political poem of the 20th century, Easter 1916. And it starts off with a reference to meeting these people with vivid faces coming from great 18th century houses and thinking they were a crowd of jokers, a crowd of fairly useless radicals, not really ever going to do anything other than march around with wooden rifles on their shoulders and hurleys and so on, pretending to be but not really serious. And suddenly discovers they were serious. And he has a little pen picture of four of the leaders. Constance Markievicz, who we've known when she was a young woman in Isidel in Sligo, a member of the Gore Booth family. Patrick Pearse, who we've known. Thomas MacDonagh, who's also a poet and academic. And then Major John McBride, Maud Gonne's estranged husband. That drunken, vainglorious lout, as he calls it, again. But then he did say, of course, he did at least say, he said he had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart, yet I number him in my song. In other words, he gave him credit for having, he too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. Terrible beauty is born. But if it was just that kind of poem, if you finished the poem there, it would have been an ordinary kind of poem, not particularly, pretty good, but not particularly distinguished. Then he goes on to launch into a meditation about the rising. And let me read it to you. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part, to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all, for England making faith for all that is done and said? We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excessive love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in verse. MacDonagh and McBride and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. Now, that poem, I think, is wonderful because it's not a cheerleader's poem. It's not a poem that says, hooray for the men of 1916, weren't they wonderful? It says, weren't they wonderful, but maybe they didn't need to do it. And wasn't what they did great, but it was also terrible. I mean, think of that line, a terrible beauty is born. He didn't say a beautiful beauty or wonderful beauty, or he didn't say an awful terrible. He said a terrible beauty. In other words, he was ambivalent about it. And the question he asked in that poem, was it needless death after all, for England making faith for all that is done and said? That is still, perhaps, the key question about 1916. Was it necessary? I mean, John Brooke was at the embassy there last year for, I think you were there, Seamus, for a session on the Home Rule Act of 1914. And John Brooke was a very big admirer of John Redmond's. And he, in response to a question from the floor, launched into a fairly severe critique of the men of 1916, saying that they had done Ireland a disservice by introducing a culture of violence and so on. Look, at this stage, we can't resolve that question. We have to leave it for people to judge themselves. But the point is that whatever is correct when he said, all's change utterly. In other words, whatever you believe about Easter Rising, if you think it's a great thing or a terrible thing or something in between, good and bad or whatever, terrible beauty, you can't deny that it had a major impact
And it is the moment when the Ireland we have today was born, and we have to be aware of that, and that's why it's important to commemorate it. And there's no better way, in my view, of understanding that particular event than reading Yeats' poem. It's a very good introduction to the issues that arise from the Rising in 1916. And I'll certainly be doing a lot of talking next year on this subject, and I hope I may even, some of you may even be able to come to some of the events that I'm planning to do. I'm going to make a fairly big commemoration, mainly because I believe that we've made a huge effort in Ireland over the last 20 years to embrace the British dimension to our history, in particular the First World War. And I think therefore it's important that we try to use next year to promote a great understanding here in Britain of the things that happened in Ireland and why they happened. And it doesn't have to be a black and white thing anymore. People can just take an interest, make an effort to understand. Because from my thinking, my way of thinking, the ultimate reconciliation between peoples or countries or traditions is when one tradition understands the other's point of view. And that's what we require in Northern Ireland, for example. We require that nationalists should somehow be able to get into the skin of the Orange man and understand how he sees things. And likewise, the Orange tradition needs to understand what the Green tradition in Northern Ireland is all about. It's only, and therefore I think next year is an opportunity to encourage people here to take a little interest in understanding, making an effort to understand the particular dynamics of Irish history at that time. The next poem I want to read as part of my illustration of Yeats's great power as a man who explains that period in our history. I think he's one of the finest and most important witnesses we have to that revolutionary period, because he was following what was going on throughout the period and writing about it. I mean, he wrote, for example, Easter 1916, 1919, which is about the War of Independence, and then this poem, Meditations in Time of Civil War. And in this poem, again, he does the same thing. He describes something he saw himself. And I'll read it to you. An affable irregular, a heavily built Falstaffian man comes cracking jokes of civil war, as though to die by gunshot were the finest play under the sun. So he describes this heavily built Falstaffian Republican who came to the door of his house in Ballylee in County Galway, near Lady Gregory's home, knocked on the door and told the aides family to stay indoors, and they blew up a bridge nearby. So, and then he goes on to say, I count those feathered balls of soot, the moorhen guides upon the stream, to silence the envy in my thought, and turn towards my chamber, caught in the cold snows of the dream. There you have again the power of Yeats's ability to fashion a perfect line, caught in the cold snows of the dream. In other words, turns back from this scene of civil war, and he's caught in the cold snow. He's suddenly, captured by this dream. But then he goes on to say, and this is the great power of Yeats again. He said, somewhere a man is killed or a house burned, yet no clear fact can be discerned. A barricade of stone or of wood, some 14 days of civil war. Last night they trundled down the road, that dead soldier in his blood, come build in the empty house at the stair. And then he goes on to this powerful meditation. And the stair, by the way, is a West of Ireland word for starting. Something you probably know, those who are from the West of Ireland. Wonderful we don't call it that. But anyway, when I first came across the stair, I wasn't fucking calling it starting. He says, we had fed the heart on fantasies. The heart's grown brutal from the fair. More substance in our enmities and in our love. Oh, honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. Powerful summary of what he had seen, that there is more substance in our enmities than in our love. So he He's making an appeal for love to triumph over enmity. So that's my little summary of Yeats as a witness. And now my final point, I think, as I say, he is a very powerful witness to the Ireland of his time. And remember, that Ireland transformed totally during his lifetime. Remember, he was born 2 years before the Fenian Rising of 1867, 20 years after the start of the Great Famine. And he died on the eve of the Second World War, when Ireland was about to establish its neutrality and therefore assert its independence in those very difficult global circumstances. So he saw the whole thing, the land war, the rise and fall of Parnell, the rise of radical nationalism, the rise of the Gaelic League, the GAA, the 1916 Rising, the 1913 lockout, the War of Independence, the Civil War, became a senator in the Irish Free State Senate, and so forth. So what I want to finally talk about is the third W, wisdom. In his later years, Yeats became a kind of a seer, and a sage, in that he started dealing with issues to do with old age and so forth, philosophical issues that are quite difficult to deal with and could become very obscure in poetry. But he wrote this great poem in 1926 called Sailing to Byzantium. Not about Ireland at all, but it's a poem that shows Yeats's ability to deal with complex issues. He once said that if he could go back to any period in history, he would go back to the time in Byzantium just before the Emperor Justinian built the great church, which is now the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. And he said he would seek out a someone who was working on gold enameling. He would seek out a craftsman, not a philosopher, but a craftsman, because he said you could learn more about life and eternal issues from a man like that than you could from a philosopher. So he felt that the man, the craftsman working in gold in Byzantium would be able to tell him more about life and death and eternity than anybody else could do. That is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas. Fish, flesh or fowl, can end all summer long. Whatever is begotten, born and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of an aging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. And therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make of hammered gold and gold enameling, to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past or passing or to come. And I think you have the last verse here. There it is, just behind me. Yeah, very good. It's so wonderful. I mean, you think about that, he talks about, an Asian man is a tattered coat upon a stick. But he says that he will sing and loudly, that he'll get his soul to clap its hands and sing and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. In other words, he wasn't going to go gently into that good night. He was going to keep on keeping on. And that's what he did. And that's why most poets, Wordsworth, who lived to a great age, in his latter years was pretty hopeless as a poet. He was still writing very powerful poems in his last months of his life, just because he had this kind of view that he was going to, fight on to the very end. And then the final poem I want to mention is among school children, because it was written when Yeats was a senator He was a 60-year-old smiling public man. I achieved that status myself just a few months ago, so I now feel an affinity with Yeats that I didn't feel when I first read this poem. I thought, gosh, must be very old, is it? But this is another example of Yeats. He starts off with a very ordinary. He visits a school in Waterford, a Montessori school in Waterford, my hometown. And then he moves on to a kind of a philosophical reflection on life. And of course, in this poem, Maud Gonne appears before him as a living child. In other words, he sees these children. He's immediately reminded of Maud Gonne. This is when the man was in his early 60s. So, you know, he was thinking back sort of probably 35, 40 years when he first met Maud Gonne. And by that time, of course, Maud was a much more elderly lady, but he sees her like a living child. I walk through the long schoolroom questioning. A kind old nun in a white hood replies. The children learn to cipher and to sing, to study reading books and history, to cut and sew, be neat in everything in the best modern way. The children's eyes in momentary wonder stare upon a 60-year-old smiling public man. Labour is blossoming or dancing where the body is not bruised to pleasure soul, nor beauty born out of its own despair, nor blear-eyed wisdom out of midnight oil. O chestnut tree, great rooted blossomer, are you the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl? O body swayed to music, O brightening glance, how can we know the dancer from the dance? So in other words, from visiting a school in Waterford as a senator, doing all the kind of public duties, it goes on to this extraordinary meditation about, what is the chestnut tree? Is it the leaf, the blossom, or the bowl? And how can we know the dancer from the dance? Is there a difference between the dancer and the dance? Or are the two things the same? So it's complex, but it's still written in very powerful poetry, which I think is still very easy to relate to, because while the subject matter is complex, language continues to be straightforward and evocative. So finally then, I would just recap by saying that I think that there's a very good argument for regarding W.B. Yeats as the greatest poet writing in the English language in the 20th century. But the great thing about Yeats is that he was also a fine 19th century poet. So he went from writing poems like I Will Arise and Go Now and Moorish Flee, a small cabin built there, a what was made, 9 bean rows will I have there, hive honeybee and live alone, bean and clay. Now that's a poem that could be written by Keats or Shelley or Wordsworth, any of those. But then, in the 1930s, in a poem called Circus Animals Desertion, he writes about, he said, I will go down where all the ladders end in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. Now, how did the man who started writing about Beelal glades and cabins on the Isle of Innisfree, which I visited there during the anniversary weekend in June, how did he go from writing those kinds of poems to writing a poem like Among School Children or Saint of Byzantium, or to writing lines like The Foul Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart, with Shelley or Keats or Wordsworth or none of those were ever written? And that's the great achievement of Yeats, that he managed to be both a 19th century poet and, in my view, the greatest poet of the 20th century in English, even though he only lived a little more than half his life in the 20th century. And I would also say, and this is probably more controversial, that he may well have been the greatest Irishman of the 20th century, but that's probably a more difficult one, because you're dealing with apples and pears. How do you compare different people from different walks of life? But certainly he was someone who I think has a good claim on our affection, because he certainly wrote powerfully about Ireland. He's left us an extraordinary legacy of powerful poems, which I think are well worth reading, well worth looking into again, especially at this time as we mark the centenary of that year, 1916, that transformed Ireland. Thank you very much.